Okay, thank you everybody. If you could just get to your seat as quickly as possible again, please. Don't worry. Yes. Hello? Is this working? Could you take your seats, please, at the back? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Please stop talking and sit down. The authoritarian approach always works. We're now moving into safety and efficacy issues, and our first speaker in this session is Professor Peter Hajek, who you've already met, a Professor of Clinical Psychology from Queen Mary, University of London. Thank you, Peter.
I was invited to talk about the progress on the Cochrane review. I'll start with the compulsory conflict of interest statements. I do collaborate with pharmaceutical industry, makers of stop-smoking medications. My research into electronic cigarettes has been funded by MHRA, NIHR, and UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies. So it's public funded, and I have no links with any e-cigarette manufacturers. The Cochrane review is in the sign-off process, so still currently ongoing. And that means, folks, that this will be a damn squib of a talk, because I won't tell you what it says. Cochrane wants to do their own launch. You don't have long to wait. But I try to make it interesting for you. I'll cover some of my own personal take on some of these issues, and maybe mention some of the results which you can glimpse from existing literature anyway. So I think introducing my talk as a dumb squid, that's some hype, but let's see. This is the review team led by Hayden McRobbie. We published the scope and methods early on. This is now the norm for the Cochrane reviews. And I think it's a very good idea, because you then you do this before you actually looked at what's out there and looked at your literature, and then you have to adhere to it. And this, to an extent, can prevent people picking up and choosing and interpreting evidence based on their agendas. It doesn't prevent it altogether, but it's the step in the right direction. You also have a clear criteria in what type of studies you can include, and that prevents one problem we have in meta-analysis, which is rubbish in, rubbish out. If you get poor studies which don't really answer the question, you can't make any more sense of them, and this type of approach prevents that to an extent. Let me tell you a bit about what Cochrane reviews are. Some of you may not be fully familiar with them. This is a gold standard of deciding which health interventions work and which don't. It will be based on randomized controlled trials, and will pass a verdict about whether it works or not based on the current knowledge. And that verdict can change as new studies are coming along. It's done by statistics, and the reason for it is obvious. If you've got 3 studies, say, of penicillin for some kind of lung infection, and one study shows that people on penicillin do better than people on placebo, the second study shows no difference, and the third one shows that penicillin actually makes it worse. Now, which of the 3 are you going to trust, and how do you make sense of this? And there's a statistical method. What it does, in principle, is to take people who had penicillin from all 3 studies, put them on one side, and then you take people who had placebo in all 3 studies, put them on the other side, and then you look at the recovery rate in these 2 groups. So you handle the 3 studies as if it was just one study. So that's in a nutshell what it is. It's a bit more complicated, because the studies may differ in the dose they used, length of follow-up, criteria of outcome, and so on. And so we have to adjust all that. But basically, you're throwing several studies together to get the result. The result is usually presented as something called a forest plot. And indeed, this is the logo of the Cochrane collaboration up there. And this is a stylized forest plot, where you will have these several studies and then what they tell you all together. I initially wanted to take you through this so that you can actually read these forest plots, and then I decided I'm not going to show you any forest plots, so I can skip this bit, and I apologize for it. But I may get a chance to go over this when Cochrane does their launch. The aims of this review are very focused. Do e-cigarettes help smokers achieve long-term abstinence? Do e-cigarettes help smokers to reduce cigarette consumption by at least 50%? Now that's a sort of a level just decided on, but you would expect there to be a health benefit if people substantially reduce their toxin intake from cigarettes. People sometimes say that, you know, even if you now smoke very little, it's as bad as smoking a lot, but that's nonsense. There is a dose response for a number of smoking-related risks. And then adverse effects associated with the use of e-cigarettes. And the main source of evidence, as I already told you, randomized controlled trials. And they will be comparing electronic cigarettes either with placebo, which in this case would be electronic cigarettes with no nicotine, so nicotine-containing or nicotine-free electronic cigarettes, or comparing with other stop-smoking medications, or comparing with any other control condition, including no treatment. This is the methods, and this is sort of standard fare for Cochrane. There's a search of various databases. You try to get awareness of any study done or even ongoing, and looking specifically for trials which are randomized smokers. And importantly, this is one of these things where you want to have make sure that the studies you interpret actually are telling something useful. There has to be an outcome of at least 6 months or longer for stop-smoking studies for Cochrane to consider such a study. If people quit for a week or two, that's not going to have much effect on their health, and so there has to be a period of abstinence to reassure you that there is some benefit, and also the longer the past period of abstinence, the more likely are people to stay abstinent in the long run. And because this is such a new field and there's not that many studies, we also reviewed cohort studies, which normally you wouldn't really look into, and I can actually cover some of these. They again have to have at least 6 months follow-up. And we also looked at other types of studies, such as crossover trials and follow-up studies with short follow-up, to see about the adverse events. So any study where people were using their e-cigarettes for a bit would be included just for that particular analysis of adverse events. People identified almost 600 records, which the team had to go through. Only a few were eligible, so the whole review is actually based on 2 randomized controlled trials, but they were good quality trials. They are, again, formal ways of assessing the risk of bias in these studies, and they both had low risk of bias. And there were 6 cohort studies, some with low risk and some very high risk of bias. And 3 more studies eligible for adverse effects analysis. And I can tell you about the adverse effects analysis because it's out there and it's more or less common sense and obvious. There were no serious adverse events related to electronic cigarettes in any of these studies. And now looking at non-serious adverse events, a cough, dry mouth, and so on, actually there were no differences between people on e-cigarettes and on the other treatments. In the Bullen study, the New Zealand study from the Lancet, you can see that nicotine electronic cigarettes, 44% of people complained about something or other during the study, 45% on patch and 47% on placebo electronic cigarettes, so it just doesn't create any additional issues. In the other study by Caponetto et al., there was no difference in frequency of adverse events again. And just to tell you what are the most frequent things people using e-cigarettes may experience, there will be cough, dry mouth, shortness of breath, throat irritation, and headache. And frequency of these adverse effects decreases over time, apart from throat irritation. Now, throat irritation is a weird one, because some people actually like it. There are smokers who say, throat hit, they actually want it. So you will have a strange mixture of, is this an adverse event or is this actually something positive? And cohort studies, of which there are many more, they report very similar findings. There will be some mouth and throat irritation would be the most frequent adverse effects, and they would dissipate over time. And the longest use of electronic cigarettes was about 18 months. So that's the adverse effects part. And now the cohort studies. And this is not the real meat of the Cochrane, but still something you may be interested in. 3 studies made it through to be included. I would not include these studies, but because of the way we set the criteria, they are in. But 2 of them, I think, are totally uninformative. They are the type of studies Robert was mentioning during the discussion. In Grana et al., 88 smokers who used electronic cigarettes at least once over the past 30 days, but still smoked, were followed up, and their change in smoking was the same at 12 months as those not trying electronic cigarettes. If you give electronic cigarettes to 10 people and 2 of them quit smoking, and you only follow up the remaining 8, it just doesn't make that much sense. The other study is the same type, again, people who use electronic cigarettes in the 30 days and still smoke. And there, of course, they are not easy electronic cigarette users. They are just people who may have tried it once from a friend 3 weeks ago, or some of them may have been users, but you don't know because the study doesn't tell you. In this case, the quit rate numerically looks a bit smaller in those who used electronic cigarettes, 11% versus 17%, but you never get to the 2 percentage points exactly the same, and this is not statistically significant difference. And then there's another study which is more interesting by Etter et al. There were smokers who were actually interested in using electronic cigarettes. So at least in this cohort, these were people who wanted to use it and went on using it. At 12 months, only about 300 answered the questions, and there was a huge quit rate in those in that subsample, but you have to realize that this is a subsample. And in stop smoking studies, we are very hard-nosed about it, and we assume that everybody who does not respond to follow-up is still smoking. It's a tough criteria, particularly here where these people are just answering something over internet, and within a year they may have a different internet access, or they were not interested in it anymore. But you still have to calculate the quit rate based on the sample and the assumption that everybody lost to follow-up is still smoking, and then you end up with 13%, which of course is not bad at all. 13% one-year quit rate is still all right, but you can't really make that much sense from these studies. The other 3 cohort studies, they are more informative. They are small, but they at least started with blank slate. They took people and gave them e-cigarettes and then followed them up. So now at least you know that these were smokers who had a go with electronic cigarettes. And the first one did include a very interesting category of smokers who do not want to quit. But they clearly want to do something, otherwise they wouldn't take part in the study. They want to limit possible dangers of their habit, but they didn't intend to quit. And that would be true for a large number of people out there using electronic cigarettes. They may enjoy their smoking. They may not be really motivated. It's not that they hate their addiction to smoking. They enjoy their addiction to smoking, but they don't want to die as a result of that. And if they can do that in a safer way, they would do that. So this is the population here, which I think is a very important population. And 13% of them did quit. So even people who are not intending to quit were encouraged to quit, and 27% extra reduced by 50% or more. You can't make much conclusions from this. It's only 40 people taking part in the study. The next one was also very interesting, but very small, 14 schizophrenic patients. Now, I did some research in smoking among psychiatric inpatients. They just can't quit. It's very tough for people suffering from psychosis to be able to stop smoking. And in this case, it says 14% quit, but of course, out of 14 smokers, that's only 2. But still, there are 2 quitters, and half of them, another 7, reduced by more than 50%. So again, this is encouraging, but you can't really make much of that. And the final study recruited, and by the way, these were people with schizophrenia not intending to quit. And the final one looked at smokers who actually did want to quit and reported a very impressive quit rate at 6 months. 44% quit, another 27% reduced by at least 50%. They also had access to stop smoking medications. So this seems to be suggesting something, but this is not the type of ingredients from which Cochrane cooks its dishes. You know, this is just cohorts. You really can't make conclusions from that. What you want to make conclusions from are randomized trials. And we only have 2 so far, but there are other in the pipeline, and we're starting a big one very soon, and other people already are doing it. But at this time, we only have these 2. And it's Caponeto et al., 300 smokers, again, not intending to quit, a very important group, received electronic cigarettes with or without nicotine. So this is your placebo-controlled randomized trial. One arm got something strange. They got their electronic cigarettes, but a few weeks into the study, they got a lower dose of nicotine. I never figured out why this was done. But anyway, they were followed up for 12 months. And then the New Zealand study with over 600 smokers who either got electronic cigarette with nicotine or without nicotine, or they got patches. Both trials used e-cigarettes with low nicotine delivery. I think this is important to take into account. Both these products actually were discontinued, I think, before the studies were even over. And one of them was tested and delivered levels of nicotine like very, very weak nicotine replacement treatment. I just finished a study. 5 minutes, okay. I just finished a study looking at 5 brands of modern cigarettes when we have this cohort of suffering volunteers who come to our lab once a week after overnight abstinence, and then they smoke, puff on that thing, and we bleed them, and we can see how quickly nicotine gets into their bloodstream and what levels they can achieve. And the modern products are getting pretty good. They're still not as good as cigarettes, but they're much, much better than this was. So these were obsolete, low delivery products tested, but they did deliver nicotine. I'm showing that. So the main comparisons the Cochrane is going to report from these studies are effects of electronic cigarette smoking reduction and cessation. And one of them, which is a bit weird, is to compare electronic cigarettes to placebo, which in this case is nicotine-free electronic cigarettes. And now you would have thought, well, why do we need to know that? No smoker is using nicotine-free electronic cigarettes anyway. But this is your gold standard for evaluating any medicine. You need to know whether it works or not compared to a placebo. But with electronic cigarettes, there's a problem, because they not only provide nicotine, they also provide sensory motor replacement. So the smoker is not giving up cold turkey on the behavioral front. They still can handle something, blow out smoke, get the throat hit. All these things, taste, smell, flavors, are present, and they may also have a function in helping people quit. They may not. These factors are tremendously important in making e-cigarettes attractive for smokers and enjoyable for use. So they may just generate more interest in it, and more people will try them. If it's effective, more people will be quitting. It may or may not contribute to the outcomes. But this is a very conservative test. You're comparing electronic cigarettes, which both provide sensory motor replacement, but only one of them gives people a little bit of nicotine. And then a comparison to other treatments is the second comparison which will be reported. And here's the dumb squid bit. I'm not going to tell you what we found, but the Cochrane collaboration will release the full review within the next 2 or 3 weeks, so you really don't have very long to wait. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter.